Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Reaction Show. My name is Andrew Velez. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Joel Dehls. This is episode number 20 of the Fantasy Reaction Show. We are here after Thursday night football with one of the best games you'll ever see in your entire lives, the Bears versus the Carolina Panthers, a wild 16-13 game. Mr. Joel Dehls, before we get into that game, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fantastic right now, my man. How are you? Just came back from the Rangers game. Saw your Rangers get a W. While I was here doing my job, sitting through the Bryce Young versus Tyson Bagent experience. How are you doing, though? Got the glasses on. That can only mean one thing.
That I'm fly.
Oh, maybe that means two things.
But the game was electric. We won 4-1. I had the time of my life. I had Bryce Young in fantasy football this weekend. Shame on fucking me. But I had to do what I had to do. I had Jalen Hurts on bye. I didn't feel like starting a skill position player in my OP. But regardless, he outscored a DJ Moore, who I'm going up against. That's a W in my book. But the game was fun as fuck, man. The atmosphere at hockey is just different. But I gotta say, I'm feeling great. I'm feeling as good as I possibly can be. I'm just excited to talk about some fantasy football, Mr. Dehls. But as we get into it, again, like I said, we just watched one of the best games that we're gonna watch all season long. Obviously, I'm talking in extreme hyperbole, as this game was wildly boring. We saw a masterclass from Tyson Bagent and of Bryce Young. Now, talk to me, Dehls. How are we feeling after this game? Bryce Young. We can talk about fantasy football, of course. This is the fantasy reaction show. But if you wanted to give a little bit more of a broader statement on Bryce Young and what you saw today, I'm more than okay to hear what you have to say about him.
It's not great. Listen, Bryce Young is a prospect. He always felt safe. Bryce Young's floor to me always felt safe. I understood the hesitation about his ceiling because he never had the biggest arm. He wasn't overly athletic. He's not big in stature. So I understand why people were kind of hesitant about his ceiling. But we're seeing the floor of Bryce Young right now. We're seeing the floor because you have wide receivers who can't extend the field. You have receivers who really can't separate. You have receivers who really can't beat one-on-one coverage. And you have offensive play calling that feels prehistoric. I mean, I'm watching on Next Gen Thursday Night Football broadcast. If you don't, you should. You get a much kind of like an all 22-ish type view. And it feels like 70% of routes are hitches and comebacks. And there's nothing that's really going down the field. And on one hand, like I said, you don't have guys that can win down the field. But on the other, if you don't even have the opportunity to, all of these linebackers and DBs can just hold underneath and really take away basically what you want to do on offense. And that's the short game with Bryce Young. So right now I'm looking at this receiving core. And Adam Thielen had himself another decent game, 6 for 42. But for PPR leagues, decent. For standard leagues, that's pretty terrible. Half PPR, not great. But you got Jonathan Mingo out there, Tommy Treble. I mean, you had someone named Mike Strachan. Never heard of him in my life. We do this for a living. I saw Mikey Groggins, diehard Panthers fan, said, I've never heard of this guy in my life. He had a 45-yard catch. Bryce Young actually threw a dot there, an absolute dot. But the receiving core and the weapons around Bryce Young right now are so ugly. And the Miles Sanders contract is awful. Giving this guy $25 million. Do you know, I don't know if you looked at the box score. Can you guess how many rushing yards he had?
It was -5, wasn't it?
Yeah, -5. -5 rushing yards for a guy you paid over $20 million to. Hubbard didn't do much more, 9 for 23. This whole Carolina Panthers team, I don't think there's anyone you can start outside of Adam Thielen. And we've seen since the bye week, Adam Thielen has not been that same type of guy that we saw the first 6 weeks of the season. He is not that type of guy that's been giving you top 10 finishes. And I have a feeling that that's what it's going to look like the rest of the way. I have a feeling that Adam Thielen is more so the guy we've seen these last 2 or 3 weeks, rather than the top 10, top 8 type of fantasy football player he was for the first 6, 7 weeks of the season.
The unfortunate part about this whole game is that this was supposed to be Bryce Young being able to pick apart a defense. And I understand he is in his rookie campaign, but you're going up against the Chicago Bears. There's absolutely no excuse for you to put the performance that you just performed. You don't throw for 200 passing yards. You don't get into the end zone not once. It's inexcusable. You're going up against a Bears defense that has allowed essentially every team that they've played to do whatever they want. Now, I understand that Sweat came in, had one of the best games that he's had all season. It's looking like the Bears made a good move. Of course, it's only one game. They paid him a lot of money. I won't say it's a good move. I won't say it's a bad move. But what I can say is that Montez Sweat had himself a great ball game. But in the grand scheme of things, if we want to just strictly talk about Bryce Young in fantasy football, he's unplayable. You're right, Joel. There's no one worthwhile starting on this Carolina Panthers team unless their name's Adam Thielen. And that's solely for the fact of he sees volume. And Bryce Young does not have anybody else that he can trust on this team to throw the ball to. And Adam Thielen is just one of those recipients. Now, this team lacks someone that can create separation on a consistent basis. That's also Adam Thielen included. And it really just lacks a quarterback right now that's confident. He's not trusting what he's seeing. He doesn't trust his guys unless their name's Adam Thielen, and it shows in the offensive production. Now, for the fact of Miles Sanders being paid as much as he is, what is it, 4 years, $25 million, and he gets minus 5 yards, Frank Reich needs to look in the mirror and really reevaluate what the hell's going on in his brain, because how is this possible? You as an organization need to do better than what you're putting forth. You're putting Bryce Young in a position to ultimately not live up to the number one overall pick. And it's allowing people to overreact. Listen, the Panthers are not good. I made that the title for a reason. I don't believe that Bryce Young is not good. I think that right now he's in one of the worst situations that we see in football, and he's being put in a position to not succeed. However, once this offense starts to, or let me not say offense, but once this franchise puts pieces in this offense that Bryce Young can actually make competent offense run, then we can really evaluate the situation. But he has no time in the pocket to really allow plays to develop, like you mentioned already. The guys on the outside really aren't doing enough to get open. The play calling itself also is erratic. It's not anything mind-blowing. It's not something that's going to get these wide receivers open on a consistent basis. So what can he do? But again, we're a fantasy show, so let's keep it fantasy football. He is not startable at all. In 2 quarterback leagues, I had to do what I had to do because Jalen Hurts was on bye. If you were one of those guys that were forced to start Bryce Young today, I feel sorry for you, because he's unstartable, and that's just essentially what you're going to get from the Carolina Panthers. Now, for sure, DB Too Easy also said that he had some misses. I don't disagree with you at all either. He definitely had some opportunities that he could have hit. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it's just bigger than Bryce Young.
Absolutely. And quickly talk about Chicago. Justin Fields is kind of expected to come back next week. He was 50-50 for this game. I feel like with the long week ahead, kind of a mini bye, he will be ready for next week. And that'll be great for DJ Moore in this offense. You know, Moore these last couple of weeks has been flex-ish worthy. He went 5 for 58 today. Probably what you were expecting with Tyson Bagent playing quarterback. But once Justin Fields is back, we know the type of upside DJ Moore has. Deontay Foreman, 21 carries, 80 yards, and a touchdown. Again, probably something you expected. You knew he was going to get around that 20 carry mark. You knew he was going to be kind of efficient around 4 carry. And you knew if he got to the goal line, he would get the ball, end up getting a touchdown, having a great fantasy day. The other options out there, Cole Kmet is kind of decent, for fantasy, 5 for 45 this week, had a couple of touchdowns last week. But outside of that, there's really nothing. Roschon Johnson did have 4 receptions, but he just isn't really involved in the offense, unfortunately. 5 carries for 18 yards, 4 receptions, so 9 touches is nice to see. Khalil Herbert is also someone who's expected back next week. So this whole running back room is probably going to get shaken up. Remember, before Herbert went down, Deontay Foreman was a healthy scratch for multiple weeks in a row. They have Darrington Evans there, who they like. Roschon, they drafted in the 4th round. So it's going to be interesting to see once Herbert gets back, which we're expecting, I would say, next week. He was full in practice Monday and Tuesday, so it was a bit of a surprise that he ended up being inactive for this game. So whether that's going to be Deontay Foreman continue to be inactive, will Roschon's role decrease even more? Will Evans become the inactive running back? That's something we'll find out next week. But there's really no other takeaways from Chicago side of things outside of Justin Fields is back next week. If Justin Fields is playing, put him in your quarterback spot.
I don't disagree whatsoever. When it comes to DJ Moore, though, he's an interesting player that I want to talk about just for the sole fact of when Justin Fields has been on the field. The two of them have an obvious connection. The last time we saw them, yeah, you could count the Minnesota game, but I don't really count that for the idea that we didn't see Justin Fields finish the entire game. Against Washington, it was one of the best wide receiver performances that we've seen all season long. And since then, he hasn't put, I don't think he's eclipsed over 70 yards since Justin Fields has been gone. So for that idea, once Justin Fields is back, now I'm back on the DJ Moore train. But with Badgett as the quarterback, you really can only feel so good about this Chicago offense. But I'm with you. D'Onta Foreman has been able to do a job. And so long as he's been able to get opportunities, like we've said for multiple weeks now, when he gets that opportunity, he has been more than capable. We've seen that over the last couple of seasons. It's just he goes to a different situation. There's guys in front of him. Inevitably, they go back to D'Onta Foreman, and he's able to produce. And against a Carolina Panthers, it was kind of inevitable that we saw him put this production forth. Now, let's stop talking about this game. Let's just move on to what people actually want to hear us talk about, and that's the starts and sits of Week 10. Santos, take it easy. Have a good night. But, Mr. Dehls, who are your quarterback starts and sits?
At the start, I'm going with Jared Goff going up against the Chargers. I know the Chargers defense last week, Drew. You're sending me these tweets. You're telling me how great it looked. But listen, they're going up against the New York Football Jets. They're going up against Zach Wilson.
Turnovers.
And they didn't turn the ball over. The Chargers offense did not turn the ball over. That means the Jets aren't going to score points. But don't let it distract you from how bad this defense has been. We've seen Tua destroy them, given Tua elite quarterback play. So we'll give him that. But Tannehill was solid against them. Kirk was amazing. Dak was great. Mahomes had over 300 yards and a half against them. They've had 3 games where quarterbacks haven't thrown a touchdown against them. Zach Wilson, Tyson Bagent, and Aiden O'Connell were the quarterbacks for those games. And the 5 other games, when they're playing competent quarterbacks, they've allowed 13 passing touchdowns in those 5 games, nearly 3 a game. So Jared Goff this week going up against the Chargers, high-powered offense, coming off a bye week. They're getting David Montgomery back too. This offense as a whole should get back to normal. Jared Goff should be looked at as a top 10 option this week.
Jared Goff is a solid name, especially for the idea of you think that the Chargers defense isn't good, but what if going up against the New York Football Jets that this is their turnaround? What if that's the case? But of course, I'm just messing around. I think Jared Goff's a solid play. He should do himself a solid job against this Chargers secondary. Now, my start of the week was my sit of the week. I seem to have a trend of doing this, Mr. Dehls. Let me say 2 weeks ago, I said my sit of the week was Rachaad White. Last week, my start of the week was Rachaad White. Now, my quarterback sit of the week last week was Mr. Geno Smith. And here I am, Geno Smith, my start of the week going up against the Washington Commanders. Right now, they rank dead last in terms of points given up to the quarterback position. They have not been able to stop a pass offense to save their life. This is not the last you've heard of starts of the week and Seattle Seahawks football players. Geno Smith has struggled mightily this season. And to show you how terrible he struggled, last week, quarterback 29. The week before that, 15. Week before that, 17. Week before that, 16. And the week before that, he had his bye week. But going up against the Giants, which I'll give him a pass, he did get injured there. Quarterback 25. His only good game of the season has ironically been against the Detroit Lions, whose secondary, I believe, is not good by any means. But if they played some bad offenses, and their stats have been able to look better than what they actually are. But talking about Geno Smith, he struggled, and that's very evident where last week going up against the Baltimore Ravens, he didn't even put up 3 fantasy points. But going up against the Commanders, this is one of those weeks where I look at the Seattle Seahawks, and they can have their breakout performance that we haven't seen since week 2 against the Detroit Lions. The Commanders really have just been horrendous stopping the pass. And when you trade away Chase Young, you trade away Sweat, it's going to be a position where the opposing team will be able to move the ball with ease. I think Geno Smith is a strong recipient of that fact.
I like that one. Moving on to my quarterback sit. It's going to be Deshaun Watson going up against the Baltimore Ravens. I know the last 2 full games that Deshaun has played, he's been a top 10 quarterback. But he played the Tennessee Titans, whose secondary is still not great, even though it has improved from when he eventually played them. And last week, going up against the Arizona Cardinals, I can't say I'm moved by these 2 performances. And listen, you spent probably a 2nd-round pick on Deshaun Watson, maybe a 3rd, depending where he fell in your league. So you probably feel obligated to start him. And there's probably not a ton of options out there. So if you have to start Deshaun Watson, it's not the end of the world. But going up against this Ravens defense, It's not something I'm excited about. One quarterback has scored more than 20 fantasy points all season. Believe it or not, was Josh Dobbs last week. Or excuse me, 2 weeks ago at this point, who had 3 total touchdowns against them. I think he ran 220, 250 total yards, but 3 touchdowns. That got him over 20 points. But Stroud, Burrow, Geno, Jared Goff all had some of their worst performances of the season against the Ravens defense. I think you should still feel some sort of optimism for Deshaun Watson going forward. He's shown in his last 2 games the ability to rush the ball. He does look a bit more comfortable in the pocket as well. But I can't trust him going up against Baltimore. This is not the spot for him. And right now you have the Ravens. Do you know on average how many fantasy points they allow to opposing quarterbacks?
Is it 11?
10 fantasy points.
Damn it. I was going to say 10.
10 fantasy points, and they have more interceptions than passing touchdowns allowed on the year. So if you even have an elite quarterback, we saw how great Jared Goff was doing going into that Baltimore game. They shut him down. So Deshaun Watson this week, not someone I'm looking forward to playing.
Deshaun was one of those that I was thinking about making my sit of the week. But I've seen him when he's been able to start and finish games, and he's been pretty solid. But going up against Baltimore, your thought process is 100% there. I was tempted to put every single Cleveland Brown offensive player as my sit of the week, but we can't do that. So I appreciate you taking the initiative and making him your sit of the week. My sit of the week is going to be someone who I've in the past supported, but at this point in time, especially against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who aren't the best defenses in terms of points allowed to the quarterback position, they are middle of the pack. They're ranked 15th. And I'm talking about Mr. Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers. Now, the last 3 weeks, we've seen him finish as quarterback 12 against the Denver Broncos, quarterback 18 against the Minnesota Vikings, and this past week, quarterback 14 against the Los Angeles Rams. Now, if we look at quarterbacks that have gone up against this Pittsburgh Steelers defense, last week against Tennessee, Will Levis, who had some impressive throws, did not crack double-digit fantasy points. Trevor Lawrence did not crack 20 fantasy points. And Matthew Stafford, who has played some really good football, he did not crack 15 fantasy points himself. Lamar Jackson, now that performance is not one that I'm going to highlight too much, because I think that the receivers sold Lamar Jackson from having himself a great ball game, but he didn't even have double-digit fantasy points himself. I think that if those receivers catch the ball, we're having a completely different discussion. This is where you can't just go by the numbers. You got to go by what's going on in the games themselves. But in the grand scheme of things, Jordan Love has not been a great fantasy option these last 3 weeks. And the tape may tell you that he's not as bad as the numbers say. But in fantasy football, when the highest of the last 3 weeks that you've put forth is 15 fantasy points, this isn't something that I'm looking forward to in a Pittsburgh Steelers defense that has been the bright spot of the team itself. And one of the main reasons why they're sitting at the position that they currently are at right now. I can't feel comfortable starting a Jordan Love this week.
Yeah, I'm with you. Jordan Love has still been good for fantasy, even though we continue to shit on him a little bit on the Real Pick Aside show. He's been on QB like 14, 16 these last couple of weeks, so a decent start. But I agree, going up in this matchup's not great. Moving on to running back starts. This feels like I'm cheating a little bit because this guy was definitely highly touted during draft season, but has disappointed. That's going to be Tony Pollard. When he was getting drafted, right, in August, September, he had that dark horse RB1 type of title on his name, like thinking that Zeke is gone. He's going to get all of these carries, the goal line, receiving work, everything. It hasn't been the case. Entering this week, he's RB18. He has just one finish within the top 10. And the last 2 weeks, he hasn't even cleared 65 total yards. But now he gets to go up against the New York Giants. And the Giants defense has improved, absolutely. But that one top 10 finish I did mention did come in week 1 when they played the New York Giants. He didn't have this huge, like 150-yard game, but he had 2 rushing touchdowns. And I think that's something that Tony Pollard's going to be able to get to in this game. Like I said, the Giants defense has been better. But last week we saw against Josh Jacobs, 2 touchdowns, nearly 100 yards. We saw Breece Hall, who they bottled up for the most part, but we still saw Breece be able to break off a big play. We know Tony Pollard has some big playability in him as well. And the Cowboys are 15-point favorites in this game. it doesn't get much bigger of a spread in the NFL. I can't remember the last time I've seen a spread this big. It might have been, I honestly think Jets versus Rams a couple years ago when we ended up winning that game the year the Rams go on to win the Super Bowl. That might be the last time I've seen a spread that big. And hey, in that game, the Jets ended up winning. So won't say anything yet, but it does feel like this is a game script where the Cowboys are going to go up early. The Giants with Tommy DeVito, with all due respect, they don't have a chance in hell to move the ball. If they score more than 10 points, I will be shocked. If they score more than 10 points, not in the fourth quarter, like not in some garbage time where they're playing prevent defense, it's going to be Giants fans for this next month or so. If Tyrod doesn't come back, I wouldn't watch Giants games. I don't think, even if you're a diehard Giants fan, season tickets, whatever it might be, I wouldn't blame you if you're not watching Giants games because it's going to be some of the worst offense we're going to see across the NFL. But Tony Pollard this week, positive game script, decent matchup, not the best ever, but a decent matchup. He's going to get probably 20 plus touches. They're going to be in the red zone area. I think he's a great start this week.
Tony Pollard has been one of the more unfortunate plays. He's supposed to be one of the more talented running backs in the game, but utilization-wise, the Cowboys have been failing Tony Pollard. He's not the type of guy that you can run up the middle. That's not his skill set. That's not his strength. Get him to the outside. Get him involved in the passing game. I think against the Giants is a great chance to really see or allow yourself to open up the playbook to a Tony Pollard. So I love that start. My start of the week is going to be one of my guys. I'm talking about Ramondre Stevenson. Ramondre Stevenson last week was RB3 on the week where he had 87 rushing yards on only 9 attempts, was able to get into the end zone. That was that big chunk play touchdown. But where he's been able to really get his work in fantasy football has been in the passing game. In the last 3 of the 4 weeks, he's seen 6 targets. And really why we have been so high on Ramondre Stevenson in the past is because, again, we say this over and over and over again when we talk about Ramondre. He's always been a reliable pass-catching option. So, again, like I mentioned, in the last 3 of the 4 weeks, we've seen him have at least 4 catches. We saw in 3 of these 4 weeks, 24 receiving yards, 51 receiving yards, and 42 receiving yards. And 42 receiving yards was one of the weeks where he did finish as the running back 3. Now, going up against the Indianapolis Colts, who right now rank 29th in terms of points allowed to the running back position, this is a prime matchup for Ramondre Stevenson to get his. Last couple of weeks, we've seen just touchdowns galore to the running back position when you're going up against the Indianapolis Colts. We saw 1 touchdown against New Orleans, 3 touchdowns from Cleveland, 2 from Jacksonville, 1 from Tennessee, 2 from Los Angeles Rams. They're going to give up points to the running back position. And against the Patriots and Ramondre Stevenson, where we haven't seen their pass game really be solidified, Ramondre Stevenson continues to be one of the main constants for this Patriots offense, and I fully expect him to be a full go.
Absolutely. Before I saw your name in the doc, Ramondre was one name I looked at. I was like, this is going to be my guy. I saw you guy, and I was like, But moving on to running back sits, I don't feel great about this one. I don't feel great about it at all because I could see the big game happening. I could see it blowing up in my face, but I don't think you have to start Gus Edwards this week. I know he's been on a tear. He's got, 5 touchdowns, 6 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. He's been unbelievable. But it's all been touchdown dependent for Gus Edwards. Before week 7, these are his finishes. Remember, J.K. Dobbins goes down week 1, so he's basically the full-time starter, from the get-go. RB 45, 22, 47, 35, 37, 37, 37. How he did that 3 weeks in a row is awfully impressive. The last 3 weeks, RB 5, RB 3, RB 11. And you might ask yourself, did something change here? You look at the snap percentage. He's been around 50% snaps since week 2. Carries, he's gotten about 2 to 3 extra carries these last handful of weeks, but nothing major, nothing, noteworthy. Receiving work, is he getting receiving yards all of a sudden? He did have 1 catch for 80 yards in that Detroit game, but outside of that, he's getting virtually nothing in the pass game department. It's just been touchdowns. Those first 6 weeks, 1 touchdown. The last 3 weeks, 6 touchdowns. So we've said it all season long. We're going to continue to say it. The running back landscape is so ugly. It is so thin that it's unlikely you have somebody that has the upside of Gus Edwards who you feel pretty confident in around the goal line that he's going to get the touches. And he's shown the explosiveness he could be at the 40-yard line and he could rip that off and have a big play. But you have seen Keaton Mitchell this past week get a bit more involved. And now you're going up against the Cleveland Browns. The Browns have allowed only 2 rushing touchdowns all season. One came against the Colts where they ran the ball 36 times. Both Zach Moss and Jonathan Taylor both got 18 carries apiece. They've held CMC to 43 yards. They've held Derrick Henry to 20 yards. And they held Gus Edwards to under 50 yards just a couple of weeks ago. So while I think starting Gus Edwards, it's not the worst play in the world, like your guy who you're going to speak to, I would much rather start Gus Edwards over the guy you will be mentioning just because of the touchdown upside there. But right now, I don't want to get too caught up in these last 3 weeks of Gus Edwards and being like must start, top 10 type running back, best offense in football, because while that is true, he's not getting anything in the receiving game. He hasn't shown to be able to get that 100-plus yard game where he's just going to churn out yards and fantasy points outside of the touchdowns. So you're still banking on him getting in the end zone. And again, great offense. It's possible. They'll be able to move the ball against Cleveland. I just don't love this matchup for him.
Gus was one of those players where early in the season, you mentioned it, he wasn't giving you anything that was sustainable or you felt like was sustainable just for the early matchups of the season. So much so that I clipped Gus Edwards in one of my leagues. Now, in hindsight, I regret that because he's been able to get into the end zone a ton. And in the running back landscape, I would have loved to have a Gus Edwards on my squad. Luckily, on that team, I have a CMC, Bijan, and Jonathan Taylor all on the same team. So it's not biting me as much as maybe a different league. But again, like you mentioned, it hasn't been anything over the top and anything overly consistent outside of the touchdowns that would make you feel like Gus's floor is a safe one. Now, you mentioned the guy that I'm going to speak about, and it's the guy on the other side, and that's going to be Mr. Jerome Ford. Now, the last time that these two did meet, Jerome Ford finished as RB30, 9 carries for 26 yards. It was one of his worst games of the season. It was his worst game of the season, if you're not going to count Tennessee. But in that Tennessee game, he did get into the end zone twice. One as a reception, one running the ball in. But in terms of efficiency, 10 carries for 18 yards. But we've seen Jerome kind of flirt with mediocrity, where RB30, RB22 did see him finish as an RB10. If you had to guess the matchup, who would it be? Indianapolis. And Indianapolis has been one of the teams that is just going to give up points to the running back, talking about my start of the week. But he was RB10 in that situation and goes from RB10 to RB48. And then this past week against Arizona, RB17. Jerome is just one of those guys where he's been great if you have dealt with injury. I know you yourself have been going through the ups and downs of a Jerome Ford experience because you've been going through an insane amount of injuries on your roster. But again, he hasn't been a bad running back play, but going up against the Baltimore Ravens, who have been one of the best rush defenses in football, one of the best defense that there is, I simply just can't feel confident about a Jerome. I already mentioned how if I had the opportunity, all Cleveland Browns players would be my sits of the week. I couldn't get Deshaun, but I'm going to have Jerome Ford as my running back sit.
Yeah, I don't feel great about it. I was actually talking to G earlier. He picked up Deontay Foreman earlier today. I'd missed the news that Khalil wasn't playing. If not, I probably would have put a little bit on him to try to get him. And I thought G, who has JT, has been asking for Zach Moss these last couple of days. I'm like, oh, easy. I'll give him Zach Moss. He'll give me Deontay. He held off. He said, nope, I want to start him this week. He made the right decision because I definitely would have put Foreman over Ford this week. But here we are. Moving on to wide receiver starts. This might be the first time I'm mentioning this player. I had him as a sit a couple of weeks ago, and he blew up in my face. DeAndre Hopkins, he's back. He's better than ever, and Tennessee Titans have life, and his name is Will Levis. While DeAndre Hopkins actually has the lowest reception percentage of his career, his 15.2 average depth of target is the highest of his career. Now, this is full season, so this isn't just with Levis. This is with Tannehill, too. It's just kind of how Tennessee has been using him. He also has a yards per route run of 2.44, which is the second highest of his career. We talked about that early in the season, how important yards per route run is. We're evaluating wide receivers. And we've seen 2 weeks now with the Will Levis experience, right? The game against Atlanta was the huge blow-up game for D-Hop, where his average up target was 24 yards. He had the multiple touchdowns, these big plays, explosive plays. And we're like, listen, that's great, but let's be realistic. You're not getting multiple touchdowns a week. You're not getting 50-yard touchdowns a week. You're not getting busted coverage plays. But then against Pittsburgh, he got 11 targets. So you're kind of seeing both sides where, great, you could get those huge upside plays from DeAndre Hopkins. But now Levis is also showing that, oh, I could give you double-digit targets. I know that you're my easily best wide receiver on this team. I'm going to give you the ball as much as I can. And Tennessee's also done a good job of lining him up in different places to kind of design him open as well. And his hands are as good as ever. He looks a bit more explosive to me than last year. I think he has a little bit more juice in him now that Levis is there. He's going to get those 50-50 balls. I'm not 100% sold on Will Levis being the franchise quarterback of Tennessee for the next decade, but I am sold on him being a fantasy franchise quarterback for DeAndre Hopkins, because this is the dream when you're thinking about your wide receiver. What type of quarterback do you want? You want someone who's going to be a gunslinger. You want someone who's going to take risk and throw up those 50-50 balls and take those deep shots. That's what Will Levis is. And he also goes up against a Bucs defense who has allowed the second most points to opposing fantasy wide receivers. Now, I do wonder what they were going into last week, because they played Houston last week and we saw Noah Brown and Tank Dell and Nico Collins got in the end zone, and Schultz as a tight end still went crazy. But even before, we saw Stephon Diggs, Khalil Shakir, and Gabe Davis all have 70-plus yards. We saw Amon-Ra and DJ Moore, both obvious wide receiver ones for their team, go over 100 yards. Great matchup. Will Levis is playing. I think DeAndre Hopkins is probably a top 15 wide receiver this week.
D-Hop, we've never had to question the talent, but when he was on Tennessee, we had to question the situation. Ryan Tannehill obviously wasn't able to get the job done, but we see now with a Will Levis, hey, maybe there's something here. And he's letting the ball fly. He's trusting his wide receiver one. It's always great to see when that's the case. When you have a young quarterback, they're always going to trust their number one wide receiver. And in fantasy football, if you are the manager of that player, you're always going to reap the benefits of that. Now, my wide receiver start of the week is someone that has not had a finish higher than wide receiver 21 this season. One of the biggest disappointments in fantasy football this year, and I'm talking about DK Metcalf. Joel, do you know what DK Metcalf's position is right now at wide receiver?
Is he in the 40s?
He's in the 40s, bro.
Is he 48?
He's 43.
43.
He is wide receiver 43. And why that's so upsetting to me is because we know what DK can be. We know how talented DK has been. Now, outside of his rookie season, his finishes have been in PPR leagues, wide receiver 7, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 16. Now, we have seen him kind of regress as the years have gone on. But again, like I mentioned, he is wide receiver 43, with his best week being week 1 at wide receiver 21. But going up against the Commanders, this is the time for the Seahawks to wake up. I told you, this wasn't the last you were going to hear of a Seattle Seahawk. DK Metcalf is going to get his. I firmly believe going up against one of the worst, and not one of, this is the worst pass offense in football. I firmly feel the Seattle Seahawks can have their breakout week offensively, and DK Metcalf can finally start to get on track.
I think DK is a great buy in dynasty leagues. I've been in one of our leagues. I've been trying to acquire him, but our manager just won't budge. But I think this is more so just with Geno Smith regressing. I think DK Metcalf is still a freak physically as a receiver. I still think he is, imposing his will against other DBs. Just Geno's not been the same type of quarterback. And regardless of if they move off Geno or stay with him for another year, I do think Seattle, after watching this season, especially if they kind of fall off second half of the year, maybe miss the playoffs, could be looking for a replacement at quarterback. Moving on to wide receiver sit, it's going to be George Pickens for me. Starting off the year, Pickens was a boomer bust wide receiver 2 finishes within the top 11, 3 finishes outside of wide receiver 37. But since Deontay Johnson's been back, he had that 100-yard game against the Rams, right? But Deontay wasn't a full-time player in that game. He played around 66% of snaps. The next 2 weeks, Deontay's been up to 90% of snaps. And in those 2 weeks, George Pickens has 3 catches for 21 yards combined. And I know the story right now is his comments on Instagram after the game saying, "Free me." Putting up kind of this negative Steelers kind of vibe he's got going on following guys, changing his profile picture, doing all of the regular, social media stuff whenever a player wants to get traded or a contract extension or whatever it might be. there's some franchises and some players that I think kind of feed into it and say, listen, we're going to get this right. We'll fix this. The one that sticks out is A.J. Brown, who obviously did not go to these heights by any means. He was just, him and Hurts had a little dialogue on the side. And after that game, A.J. Brown was one of the best wide receiver runs we have ever seen in the NFL. 125 plus yards, 6 straight games, NFL record. Pittsburgh doesn't strike me as the type of organization to do that, right? For one, they seem very hard-nosed. Mike Tomlin is obviously a no bullshit type of guy. He wants you out there playing. He does not want you on social media. And two, with all due respect to George Pickens, he hasn't shown enough to the Steelers to warrant this type of reaction. He hasn't done enough to have kind of Antonio Brown type of attitude towards his last couple years in Pittsburgh, where AB was the best wide receiver in football. So you kind of just put up with this shit. George Pickens has some talent. He's not that type of guy. So now he's going up against Green Bay, who's been great against opposing wide receivers, allowed the 8th fewest points. He's the clear second option behind Deontay Johnson on a bad offense. Like I mentioned, a tough opponent in the Green Bay Packers. I am passing on George Pickens this week.
I'll tell you what, Joel, I wish you had the goal to go with this wide receiver sit. And when we were having dialogue of who was going to be in the thumbnail, I thought you were on board with me. Now, maybe it's pride, because you had some discussions earlier in the season with a fellow friend of ours talking to us about potentially this player not being a top 15 player in fantasy football at his position. Now, I'm talking about Davante Adams. Davante Adams has been in that conversation with the DK. Now, he hasn't been as disappointing as DK, but over these last, let's say, 5 weeks, he has most definitely been one of the most underwhelming players, where he has not even cracked double-digit fantasy points. Davante Adams, one of the best we've ever watched in our lives. And he's going up against the New York Jets, who right now rank first in terms of fewest points allowed to fantasy wide receivers. On my list, I have Davante, I have Jacoby Myers. How can I feel great with either of these two guys? I know I just saw Keenan put up a solid game against the New York Football Jets, but that was Keenan being a freak. And now we know that Davante and Jacoby can have those types of performances, but are we going to trust that with Aiden O'Connell as opposed to a Justin Herbert who can put his receivers in situations to succeed? And even Herbert had himself a shitter.
He did.
So if that's the case, and I'm looking at Davante Adams, have wide receiver 49, 67, 31, 100, and 49 finishes in a row. How can I feel good about him going up against the best pass defense in football, in fantasy football, as of right now? I simply can't. It's got to be Davante Adams, and I know he's one of the best we've ever seen. I know he's been a fantasy football dream. Just look at his history. We're talking about, at this point in time, he's still a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy football, but he is living off that game versus Pittsburgh where he went for 172 and 2 touchdowns. We've seen him finish as wide receiver 3, 2, 1, 23, did miss 4 games. Wide receiver 3, 14, 10. He's been a model of consistency. But with Aiden O'Connell as his quarterback, with Jimmy Garoppolo as his quarterback, Brian Hoyer as his quarterback, we simply haven't seen him be that same dominant guy. I can't feel confident about him this week.
I'm with you. So let's give, and I saw Football CF. We will read super chats at the end.
Of course.
Let me give you a few names. You tell me if you're going with Tay or if you're going with these guys.
All right.
Tyler Lockett going up against Washington.
Tyler Lockett.
Okay. How about Deontay Johnson going up against Green Bay?
Deontay Johnson.
Okay. Michael Thomas going up against the Vikings.
This is where I draw the line. I mean, this really could be the same output. It could be the same output. I'll respect Davante Adams.
How about Zay Flowers going up against the Browns?
Fuck. I have to respect Tay here, even though I don't feel good about it. I don't. Okay, I'd rather neither. Can I say neither?
Okay, we'll skip that one.
All right. Cool.
I have 3 more here. Jerry Jeudy, Tank Dell, Jahan Dotson.
Jahan going up against Seattle's intriguing. He's been great these last 2 weeks. Tank Dell versus
Tank Dell's playing Cincinnati.
Cincy. Cincy's been a solid pass defense, but we have seen CJ play well. I'll lean Tank because he has that big play upside. Of course, so does DAVANTE, but I feel like it's more likely in Tank Dell's situation versus Cincinnati as opposed to the Jets, who've been playing near perfect defensive football. And Jerry Jeudy versus the Bills. I lean Jerry. The
Okay,
Bills secondary has been vulnerable.
there it is. We're looking at Tay as a wide receiver 3, as a flex. So look at your bench, look at your other options. That's how you should play him going forward. I wouldn't say going forward, just as Jets opponent. It's a tough matchup. Lastly, though, we'll do tight end starts. And honestly, we don't have a ton of sits because that's just the landscape of this league. But my tight end start is going to be Taysom Hill. I don't think this is a flash in the pan. I think Taysom Hill is here to stay. He has 5 carries within the 5-yard line, converted 2 of those into touchdowns. He has 13 carries within the 10-yard line, which would rank in the top 10 among all running backs. On top of that, he's seen 5 or more targets in 3 or 4 games. He has combined 20 carries for over 100 yards in the last 2 games. And he's even seen a few passing attempts the last couple of weeks. He's put up tight end 6, 6, 3, and 6 numbers. That's 12, 16, 22, and 20 fantasy points. You're getting damn near quarterback production from your tight end. You know, he's more of a rusher than anything at this point, but he's a great rusher. And you've mentioned it on the show, I think on the last episode, where the Saints' red zone offense woes the first half of the season were really ugly, but they've been using Taysom Hill in the red zone, within the 5, within the 10, and the red zone offense has gotten a lot better. So start Taysom Hill. I'm sure if you have him, he's already in your lineup. But I even think as a flex play, would you rather start Taysom Hill or Davante Adams?
Taysom Hill.
There it is. If you have Taysom Hill, it should be in your lineup this week.
It'll be fucking poetic if Davante finally has his blow up a game against one of the best defenses in the league. But I still feel uberly confident that just won't be the case, especially with what he's put forth these last 5 weeks. He's done nothing. And Taysom Hill, who, when he gets to the goal line, it's his offense.
Yep.
Forget about, we're going to see Taysom. No, the offense runs through Taysom once that ball gets within that 10 to 20-yard line. Taysom's been awesome in fantasy football, and especially in tight end leagues, the fact that you can start him at tight end, it's a cheat code option. So I love that start of the week. My start of the week is going to be Mr. Trey McBride, and this is with Kyler Murray coming back. This has been one of the more anticipated returns, and I love Kyler Murray. I do. But what has been the issue is that Atlanta's defense and Atlanta's team as a whole, let me not single out the defense because the defense has been pretty solid. But Atlanta's team has been so inconsistent that how can I feel confident that even in his first week back, that Kyler Murray can't go out and have himself a great debut? Now, if you look at Trey McBride, over the last 3 weeks, he's been one of the most targeted tight ends in football. I'm talking top 5 most targeted tight ends in football. And that's been without Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray knows that he has to target his best options now. I love a Hollywood Brown going forward, like you've mentioned in our shows prior. And Trey McBride, who I've mentioned, has been one of the most targeted. We didn't see him have the greatest game against Cleveland because, again, Cleveland's been one of the most dominant defenses that there is. But he did see 5 targets. The week before that, 14 against the Baltimore Ravens, who have one of the best defense, if not the best defense in football right now. And against Seattle, 6 targets. I think with Kyler Murray's return, I'm not thinking that this is just a flash in the pan. Shout out to Big Chuck. Trey McBride, start of the week. I firmly am buying the hype. I think that he can have himself a great performance, especially in Kyler Murray's debut this season.
Absolutely. Do you have a tight end sit? I'll just throw one out there. Jake Ferguson has been great these last couple of weeks, but I feel like this might be a game where Dallas just doesn't need him. Like I mentioned with Tony Pollard, I think they're just going to dominate the Giants to the point where Ferguson might get into the end zone, but it just feels like a blowout second half. They might not even have to pass the ball.
So I've struggled to find a tight end. In my notes, I have this person does not exist. but I still firmly feel that way. If I had to point someone out, I'd probably go Njoku going up against the Ravens. But even still, that's not one that I feel great about. We saw Njoku get into the end zone last week. I just mentioned Trey McBride and his production against the Ravens when the Cardinals and the Ravens played. So again, I don't know if I love sitting any, or just going out there on a limb and saying anyone. If I had to say someone, I'd go Njoku for that matchup versus a Roquan Smith and the Baltimore Ravens. But the tight end landscape has been such a crapshoot. Last week we saw an exuberant amount of tight ends get into the end zone as well. It's just such a flash in the pan when it comes to that position that I don't feel great sitting anyone. We have a Kira White coming in and commenting Musgrave. I understand that going up against Pittsburgh. Again, I'm with you there where Jordan Love's one of my sits of the week. Musgrave can go hand in hand there. But I try to think more of the upper echelon guys, and I feel like I categorize Njoku as a top 10 tight end in this league, deservedly so. And so going up against the Baltimore Ravens, if I had to pick one, I would single out Njoku.
Shout out to our guy Jamie. He's asking Kittle or Laporta this week. Kittle has a great matchup
Interesting.
going up against Jacksonville. Laporta has a great matchup going up against the Chargers. I think I'd lean Laporta here, though.
I think Laporta has a safer target floor.
Agreed.
Where Kittle, he can have the blow-up game. He's one of the best, forget about just tight ends, one of the best performers of the week. Laporta is going to get targeted a ton. Jared Goff's second option, not even a question.
Mm-hmm.
I like Laporta there for sure.
Absolutely. So let's go here and do the Blue Tent report, go through all the injuries for this week. So just to knock off all of the guys who practice in full on Thursday, I'm getting this information, by the way, from the Fantasy Source _ on Twitter. Great resource for all of your injury news. So Deebo Samuel, we talked about last week, he will be playing. David Montgomery is going to be back. Christian Watson is back practicing. Deshaun Watson, Will Levis, Tyler Lockett, Kenneth Walker, JSN, Drake London, all full and practiced on Thursday. So barring something odd on Friday, if someone ends up being a DNP or something like that, you should expect all of these guys to play with basically no limitations. The only one that might be limited just in terms of workload is Kenneth Walker. We've seen these last couple of weeks, Zach Charbonnet get a bit more involved, and Kenneth Walker's carries have come down. So still has a great matchup this week, still playing him, but just something to look out for. Players who did not practice on Thursday. Josh Downs dealing with that knee injury. He had the injury coming into the week on Sunday. Seemed like he re-aggravated during the game. He is not practicing. Seems like a long shot if he will play. T. Higgins, this is super unfortunate. So coming off the best game of his season, over 100 yards, him and Joe Burrow finally got that connection back. Tweaked his hamstring in practice. And the fact that he's getting ruled out on a Thursday for a Sunday game is not good news. This seems like it could be something that's multi-week. This is obviously a hamstring injury. It could linger. You've talked about Aaron Jones previously, how he injured that hamstring in week 1. Last week, he got 20 carries, right? It's week 9. It took 2 months for the Packers to fully trust him with the workload. Super unfortunate, but T. Higgins did not practice. DK Metcalf dealing with a hip injury. This is not something I saw on my radar, so I have to double check this one. Because I don't remember him injuring it during the game, but I think he actually might be nursing the hip injury. Now I'm talking about it out loud. But moving on to Treylon Burks, obviously had that really scary concussion on last week. He won't be playing. Dameon Pierce dealing with an ankle injury. Seems unlikely he will be playing. Nico Collins also came up with a calf injury during practice. We don't really know if he's going to play yet. Friday practice reports will tell us, give us a better outlook on that. Kendre Miller, another kind of unfortunate injury. Every time Kendre comes back, he has a couple of good plays, and then he gets banged up again. He's dealt with like 3 or 4 injuries his rookie season already. He's dealing with an ankle right now. DeMarcado is dealing with the toe, and Ryan Tannehill not starting regardless, but still has that ankle injury that he's dealing with. Moving on to players who were limited on Thursday. Jamar Chase, who had that back injury towards the end of the Buffalo Bills game, seems like he's going to play. I would lean towards playing, but something we have to monitor. Back injuries could be, obviously a bit tricky there. Demario Douglas dealing with an ankle, probably a flex play, but regardless, something to monitor. Aaron Jones is probably going to be limited for the rest of his career, let alone this season, but dealing with that hamstring injury. Zay Jones still trying to come back. Curtis Samuel with the toe. James Conner's an interesting one because we just saw Khalil Herbert, go on IR, practice in full back-to-back days, and be inactive. James Conner has been practicing in limited fashion these last couple of days. Again, another running back coming off IR. So if he plays, I think you should start him. James Conner, he's a workhorse, right? He's going to get looks. He's going to get carries, but something to look for, someone to look for before Sunday gets going. Michael Wilson, David Njoku dealing with some injuries here. Justin Jefferson with that hamstring injury seems like he's at least another week away. It might be 2. TJ Hawkinson, who had that rib injury in last week's game, says he's pretty sure he's going to play, but is on the practice report, injury report that is. Osborne dealing with that concussion. Robert Woods dealing with the foot injury. Pierce with an ankle. Rashad Bateman with the back. And Keaton Mitchell, who was the, kind of hot topic of the waiver wire show last week, came up with a hamstring injury in practice. This isn't great news, but if he's practicing limited on Friday, right now, Keaton Mitchell is someone you want to see at least one more week of. What's the snaps look like? What does the carries look like? Is he taking away snaps from Justice Hill or Gus Edwards? Because last week was a lot of garbage time work, but he showed the explosiveness. And, John Harbaugh came out and said that he's going to have some sort of role in this offense. But Keaton Mitchell, don't think you should be starting him. He's someone you should have on your bench. Wait and see. And maybe down the line, he becomes more of a timeshare in that backfield.
I'm with you. It's unfortunate that Keaton had this injury because he's looked the best, in my opinion, of all these Baltimore running backs. And for that to be the case, he easily could have slipped into that opportunity, especially where we spoke about a Gus Edwards, where he hasn't been the most consistent outside of course, getting to the end zone. That's where you salvage a bunch of fantasy performances. But last week, Keaton looked explosive. And for this to be the case is pretty unfortunate. All right, let's get into Super Chats, and then we'll wrap up the show. Football CF Candy, we weren't going to forget about you, man. Is the Bears trade an all-time fleecing? Caleb 2024. The Bears are going to end up with one of the coolest, most impressive draft class that we are going to watch. I mean, but they are the Bears. Anything's liable. They can butcher this. However, it should be a Caleb Marvin Harrison Jr. masterclass. And if that happens, and when that happens, I'm going to be here for it. I'm going to be first in line.
Fans.
Chicago, stand the fuck up. That is going to be one of the cooler days in football history, because that should ultimately turn around or be the beginning of the turnaround of the Chicago Bears. The Panthers are lost right now. And again, we spoke about it earlier in the show. Until the Panthers put Bryce Young in a situation that isn't toxic, he's going to continue to fail and look as bad as he did against the Chicago Bears defense, a situation that he should have been able to handle. Now, it's that time of the show. We're going to get into some of your questions. If you guys have any questions related to start sits, now is your time to drop them into the chat below. But before we do that, if you guys have stuck around this long, please go ahead, drop a like on this video. It helps us out a bunch. If you aren't already subscribed to the YouTube channel, go ahead. Now's your time to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Turn on the notification bell as well to know when we go live, like nights like tonight. We go live every Sunday, every Thursday for the Fantasy Reaction Show. But you also get caught up to date on when the regular Pick a Side podcast does drop. Riv Academy, Joel Moran Show. We're always dropping. We drop at least, 5 times a week at this point in time. So you turn on that notification bell, you can best get notified when we do drop.
Dude, but again, can we change this title and spell Davante Adams' first name right?
Dude, appreciate that.
Just notice it.
Did I spell it wrong? Dude, appreciate that.
There we go.
Spell it wrong? How do I spell it?
D-A. We're here.
D-E-V-A-N-T-E?
D-A-V-A-N-T-E, yeah.
Okay, two ways. We're here. So yes, Pigside Meme. First off, I'm shocked to see you still here. And yes, Riv is slacking. It's been over a week since he's dropped his last video, but I believe in him. Kira White goes and asks, Curtis Samuel or Brandon Cooks at second flex? Brandon Cooks going up against the Giants. Curtis Samuel going up against the Seahawks. Not great plays either which way. With the way that Curtis Samuel has been targeted, I trust his floor, believe it or not, more so than a Brandon Cooks.
I'm with you, Curtis. I'm here too. I'm starting Curtis Samuel. The Cooks situation is similar to why I had Ferguson as my sit, where it just doesn't feel like a week they need him, right? And even Cooks last week going up against Philly, where everyone went crazy, he really didn't do much. So I don't love Cooks.
All right, Isaac asked us who to start at flex: Mike Thomas, Najee, Madison, or Dotson. On three, let's give our answer. 1, 2, 3. Jahan, baby. It is time. Unleash him. Going up against Seattle. We already seen it 2 weeks in a row. He's been able to be fantasy relevant. This is the third week in a row. Third time's the charm. It's time, baby. We've been waiting for it. It's finally Jahan Dotson time. What are some good streaming defenses? Now, I'm glad that he asked this question because I have had to stream defenses the last 2 weeks where Kansas City has been on bye. That's been my primary defense. But I have Seattle going up against Washington. Seattle has been one of the better plays in fantasy. They're a top 10 defense. Washington, although has been great offensively throughout the entirety of this season, they are going to allow a bunch of sacks. Last couple of weeks, we've seen Sam Howell limit his sacks, but going up against Seattle, who's been able to get to the quarterback, I love Seattle going up against Washington.
I think the Green Bay Packers going up against Pittsburgh and that lackluster offense is a good one. I saw someone also comment saying they're starting the Raiders defense against the New York Jets. The Jets offensive line is beat up to shreds. Zach Wilson is playing, so there's some upside there too.
Okay. Gio asks us, Trevor Lawrence or Kyler Murray? I'm going with Trevor. I don't love the Niners secondary. I understand that we haven't seen Trevor be this prolific fantasy football player. But again, I think the Niners secondary is vulnerable. I love Kyler Murray. I think that he can have himself a solid ball game, but it is his debut. You have to temper expectation. And Trevor Lawrence going up against the Niners, he can have himself a ball game.
Yeah, I'm with you. Give me Trev. Could be a high-scoring game, but it could also be a surprising kind of 21-17 game. But I want to see a week of Kyler before I put in my lineup.
All right. And listen, that's going to do it from us over here at the Fantasy Reaction Show, episode number 20. We're going to be back here Sunday night after those games to recap all of Sunday's football. But again, if you have any comments, any questions, drop them down below. We answer almost all of your guys' questions to get you guys ready for your upcoming week. Listen, it's week 10. Playoffs, if you guys are in two-week playoffs are right around the corner. If you guys are in 1 week playoffs start week 15. You guys, this is your times where you can make your moves to win your fantasy seasons. Make sure you guys are tuned into the show. We're always going to give you guys the best advice that you can. And so that's going to wrap up from us over here at the Fantasy Reaction. And we will see you guys